Welcome to today's edition of Daytime Dialogues. It is my great honor to be able to share this half hour with Professor Lawrence Schiffman, who is the Judge Abraham Lieberman Professor of Hebrew and Judaic Studies at New York University, the Director of the Global Institute for Advanced Research in Jewish Studies, a noted scholar who is a specialist in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Judaism in the late antiquity, the history of Jewish law and Talmudic literature. And on top of it all, a person who helped me get my PhD as being a member of my committee way back when I was at NYU. In between those years also, Professor Schiffman was the vice provost at Yeshiva University for undergraduate education, a professor there as well. He's an author, he has books, he has articles. I could probably spend a half hour just reading his resume, but instead, I have the opportunity to have a conversation with Professor Schiffman. Thank you so very much for joining me today.
Okay, thank you very much.
So let's jump right into it. Today is Hanukkah, and the whole time that Hanukkah takes place is an area of your expertise in Jewish history. My understanding is that we understand it all wrong, that the way we've always been told the story of Hanukkah about the evil Antiochus, who was Antiochus Epiphanes IV, is not exactly what was taking place. How does the historical record differ from our memories of the stories we were told?
Well, the way we're told the story is basically a typical story of anti-Semitism. And this guy decided he wanted to wipe out Judaism because he couldn't stand the idea that Jews were different from other people in his kingdom. And so he decided to restrict Jewish observance. And then some of our forefathers rose up in rebellion against him and succeeded actually in defeating him. But now this is a way oversimplified story. I think what's interesting is that the historical truth has crept in much more than people realize. Because when we start to discuss the problem of Hellenization in connection with Hanukkah, we're getting to the real theme, to the real issue. Namely, that the real question was the extent to which Jews should assimilate themselves into this Hellenistic wider culture, Hellenistic not really being Greek, but being very much like Greek influenced and Greek involved. And this culture, which in every single place that it came, sort of melded with the native culture, was what for Judaism meant, that's what we term Hellenistic Judaism, meant a whole variety of changes in the way of life that would take place as a result. Now, there were some Jews who wanted to do this for economic, political, and social reasons. They wanted to assimilate much more into the Greco-Roman world. And therefore, they were moving in this direction. And what really started off the entire thing was that some of these Jews who were allied with the Hellenist side began to move in directions of what we call the Hellenistic reform in 175 BCE, when, for example, Jerusalem was turned into a Hellenistic city, what's called a polis. And when that happened, then there also was, at the same time, this resulted in the loss of political rights for those who were not citizens. We don't always hear when we're in the 6th grade learning about the polis and the great democracy of ancient Greece that only 15% of the people were citizens. The rest of the people were various lower statuses, including large numbers of slaves. So in terms of the Jewish community, what the notion was put forward that Jerusalem be turned into a polis, it also meant that many Jews lost their rights as legitimate citizens of the Jewish community. Well, anyhow, all of this led eventually to low-level rioting that itself eventually transformed into inter-Jewish conflict on a large scale. Now, when this inter-Jewish conflict got more and more serious, Antiochus IV decided that he would come in with his military power on the side of the Hellenists, because obviously they were his people supporting him, working with his government, etc. And that in turn resulted in the Maccabees rising to the challenge of what becomes a full-scale war, which eventually we won. Don't be so surprised we won, because we are watching as Ukraine is defeating Russia, something which is astounding from what we would have thought before. So it seems that wars can be won by smaller groups fighting for their own territory. And in many ways, that's one of the reasons why Israel was able to win its wars throughout the ages. So I think that's what we see happening.
So in essence, it started almost like a civil war?
Yeah, I
And
think you could,
that
yeah.
brought Antiochus into the battle.
That's right. That seems to be what we now know from an emphasis on Second Maccabees. There are two books of Maccabees. It's not like 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. It's these are separate books, and the one called 2 Maccabees tells us that account. The one Maccabees does start with the decrees of Antiochus, so it makes it seem that there's just an anti-Semite who wants to stamp out Judaism. But when you look at 2 Maccabees, you see the whole background and the manner in which the challenge of Hellenism was the thing that was really going on at the time.
So do we have, as a historian, beyond the Jewish sources, both in terms of the Gemara, but also in terms of the Apocrypha, the Maccabees books, are there other documents that exist from that time that can help substantiate the way?
Not really, not really. Here's the problem. There are other documents that can tell us a little bit about the way in which the Seleucid, as we call the so-called Syrian Greeks, were running their government and dealing with other countries and stuff like that. But we don't have real external information. Josephus just copied 1 Maccabees. And 1 and 2 Maccabees are the only really reliable sources. And here's a funny story. So I figured, in the spirit of your question, which is the question that anybody who understands how we do Jewish history would ask, let's find out about what the other guy said, right? So I decided to look for some books about the Seleucid Empire and Antiochus's empire. Now, there's some information known, but here's the funny part. When you take out these books, most of the information comes from the Jewish sources, the books of Maccabees, and later on from Josephus. They don't really have too much independent material. There's some, the unfortunate fact is that the Herodotus, right, is too early for most of what we're talking about here. And we don't really have the type of information we would like to have about them. But nonetheless, some things we do know, and one very important thing we know is that there's no record of Antiochus trying to Hellenize any other parts of his kingdom. So it wasn't a kind of campaign to bring everybody into one society. That wasn't what was going on.
So in other words, we were able to then make the conclusion that if it only happened in Judea, in Israel, then it must have had something different going on there versus everywhere else.
Yes, and it was the decision of some Jews to begin a process of moving towards Hellenization, having Hellenistic schools, teaching in the Greek manner, etc. And this was what was going on there.
Okay. And it was also partially a result of the ability, beginning with Jason, to purchase the role of the Kohen Gadol.
This was a whole problem, because what happened was that the Kohen Gadol was not just the high priest. This goes back all the way from after, as soon as the Tanakh stopped. From the Tanakh running afterwards, the basic rule of the country was in the hands of the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. As a result of that, when the Seleucids came into power, now in parentheses here, people should know that from the death of Alexander the Great, which is in 323 or so BCE, until the time of the Maccabean rebellion, practically up to 198 BCE, which is a little bit before, of course, Maccabean revolt, 168 to 164 BCE, but until 198, it took place in constant battles over Eretz Yisrael between the Ptolemies who ruled Egypt and the Seleucids who ruled Syria. Constant battles. Every couple of years, another army would march through against the other army, and who was ruling would change. It's so complicated that if we tried to recite it now, we just bore everybody, and they wouldn't know anyhow, because I can't even remember all the battles, and I've been doing this for years. So there's no point even trying. And the fact is that what then happened in 198, when Antiochus III took control, he came in with a very pro-Jewish approach. And this pro-Jewish approach, recognizing the rights of the Jews and the religion of the Jews, all this kind of stuff, was fantastic. And that was the way things were running along at the beginning of this period, right? Until some Jews decided that they wanted to get closer to this Hellenistic empire, Seleucid empire, than they really were required to. And it's this, you could say, mistake, or we could say from a kind of Jewish point of view, assimilationist approach, because in certain sense that's what it was, right? That eventually leads to other Jews rising up against them and as we said before, Antiochus trying to support those Jews, and in the end, a battle which the Jews won. By the way, I think we should talk a little about the end of the story, because the story doesn't end with the temple's rededication. That's really not true, because by 100, that's in 164 BCE. By 100, the Maccabees have been kicked out of Jerusalem, and the Seleucids and their Hellenistic Jewish partners are back in control. And Yehuda Maccabee, Judah, gets killed on the battlefield. And it's only in 152 that Jonathan, through some very, very clever political action, is able to get himself recognized by the Seleucids as the ruler, and that the story ends with the establishment of the empire of the Hashmonaim, Hasmoneans. People, I think the Jewish community don't really understand not only how it started, they also understand how it ended. Yeah.
So, but how are we able to really understand Chazal when they said Yafta Lukim Leyefet, that they saw the beauty that existed within Greek society, Greek culture, that there was beauty, and yet there was this boundary that they didn't want to Hellenize, but they wanted to take pieces of it. How do you work with the two?
Well, the funny thing is that this is the situation exactly today, that the Jews have to decide in every generation. It's the nature of the whole system of Judaism, right? What are some things that the general culture developed that we want to participate in? And what are things that we cannot participate in, either for halachic reasons or because we don't want to lose our identity? And these are decisions that have to be made in every generation by being this type of minority in world civilization that partakes of world civilization. And I think that statement of Chazal is recognizing that fact. It's not just recognizing the beauty, but it's recognizing that a lot of the stuff we really actually want to participate in. And those are the things that we somehow judge instinctively or halachically or some other way to be good or right. But then there's a lot of stuff that we don't want to have anything to do with. So we want to find a way to stay away from it. So we have to erect boundaries. I think this is really, I mean, the idea that anybody thinks that you could talk about absolutes, either we want all of it, we want none of it, it just doesn't work. And I guess it doesn't work for any group. It's not possible. So I think that's really the challenge that Hanukkah continues to pose, because in the people who were the anti-Hellenists, they themselves were accepting certain things. You can see this when we look at the Mishnah, right? You could see that you have not only in the Mishnah already, you have all this Greek terminology, much of which has to do with technology that was accepted from the Greek world and all this kind of stuff. And yet at the same time, that's to talk about the architecture and everything else. But at the same time, you have the rules of staying away from many things. And how does that work? And how do you draw the line? And that's that is, I think, the challenge.
So to go a little bit later into Jewish history, or earlier and then later, when did the rift arise between the Tzaddukim and the Prushim, the Pharisees and Sadducees? According to when I was in college and we studied Zev Yavitz, he says it starts in the time of Nehemiah. He badlu, that's the Prushim. So that's 100 years plus before Alexander the Great.
I think it's very important to define what we mean, because if you ask literally, when did the Pharisees and the Sadducees start? We can easily say that we don't hear about them as groups until Josephus's description, right after he tells us that Yonatan the Maccabee took control in 152 BCE. And in the beginning of the Hasmonean era, he then goes on and tells us that, by the way, there were 3 Jewish groups at that time. So if you're strictly talking about people with that name, so the date of origin is the date of origin, okay? So let's take a parallel example to this. You say, when was the state of Israel established? You'll say 1948. Well, okay, that's the time when it formally becomes a state. But of course, we know that there's a prehistory of setting up institutions of the state that starts already in the 1930s. And that there's a progress until all the institutions of the state are set up, and then it's finally declared to be a state. Now, just using that example over here, so the question is, in here we're talking really ideas rather than state organization. But if we go back, we can find many of these ideas at earlier times. And a very prime example of this is that there's a small book written by Louis Finkelstein, who was a great scholar and the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, that he wrote a small book which most people think is very far out, in which he claimed that the division between the Pharisees and Sadducees started with the time of the prophets. And his argument was that at the time of the prophets, you already see a kind of more liberal group, the Pharisees, and the more strict constructionist group, the Sadducees. Of course, this is way overboard, but even though it's way overboard, what he's pointing to is some of these trends that are preceding the forming of these groups. So that's why what I think we have to realize, that some of the ideas that underlay the Pharisees and Sadducees go back much earlier. And of course, the many aspects of, for example, Pharisaic tradition in Ezra and Nehemiah, you already have Midrash. So this is a fundamental principle which becomes part of the Torah Shebal Peh, which develops through the Pharisees into the Tanaim, the teachers of the Mishnah. So already you see that these trends and these ideas are there. But on the other hand, the thing with the title is nowhere to be found and didn't exist.
So that's from the time of the Maccabees is when we first started
We
having
really see Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, right?
Interesting.
And of course, at the same time as Dead Sea Scrolls begin to.
Which is the perfect segue, because that's what I was going to ask you about next, is one of the key scholars of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And anytime you study anything about the Dead Sea Scrolls, you always find Professor Schiffman's name associated, whether it's an author or it's a footnote. He's there always. Why, beyond the fact that it's cool that they found these things, that it's in the display cases, why should we really care about the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Okay, so let's start out by saying that the Dead Sea Scrolls constitute the earliest texts of the Bible that we have. So just from this point of view, it shows us that our Bible was the Bible, and that's the case even with some issues of textual variation and things like that that are important and very interesting for those of us interested in the history of the biblical text, but really have very little to do with the teachings of the Bible, which are there in the way we know them. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that it allows us to fill in a tremendous amount of information about the years in which Judaism is moving from the end of the Tanakh to the time of the Mishnah. Now, in that period, we had a lot of information before from Josephus, from a whole variety of texts, many of them in Greek, some of which were in the Apocrypha, which are preserved by the Catholic Church, and so-called pseudepigrapha, which are other books from that period. But somehow or another, it took the Dead Sea Scrolls to shock people into realizing that this is really the evidence, all this stuff that we have, of how Second Temple Judaism was functioning, who the groups were, how they argued with one another, how things were developing, and how Judaism as we know it from the Mishnaic period on was becoming the norm and dominant form of Judaism. And we would not have anywhere near the information we now have without these documents, even though ironically the Dead Sea Scrolls don't have more than a couple of little scribbles here or there, what we would call historical data, in the sense that we understand historical data, names, dates, times, like the books of the Maccabees or Josephus. They don't have anything like that. But they allow us to reconstruct all kinds of things that are going on at the time and to understand a tremendous amount more about the inner debates and inner discussions in Judaism, and especially in regard to the history of halakha, tremendous amount of information there.
Now, how did you get involved with Dead Sea Scrolls?
Well, it's a funny story. I got started in Dead Sea Scrolls. I was looking for a senior honors thesis in Brandeis, and Nachum Sarna, who had spent much of his life studying Tehillim, studying Psalms, suggested to me that I do a paper comparing the Psalms, the real Psalms, to the Hodayot scroll, which is a poetic scroll with beautiful poetry, religious poetry in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And after doing that, I went on to do one of my doctoral exams in one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then I guess I got hooked and chose a doctoral dissertation topic in Dead Sea Scrolls, and that was it. It didn't end since then. And I just recently published in 2022, along with a former student, Andrew Gross, a new edition of one of the larger scrolls, the Temple Scroll. So I guess I'm still going at the Dead Sea Scrolls.
But there was a time where it was somewhat closed to scholars where you couldn't get into it. And yet you were one of those people who seemed to have been in the inner circle of scholars.
Well, no, actually, it's not exactly like that because I could not get I was in an inner circle of the people who wanted the rest of it to be released. Because what happened was there was a group who are the students of the original editors who are holding many of the scrolls. So the rest of us could get a lot of stuff, but we couldn't get what is now known to be 3/4 of the corpus because they weren't publishing it and they weren't allowing access until that situation was overturned. And it's a whole complex story, which would take 2 hours to explain, but it was overturned. And then we all became the editors who finished the publication of the rest of the scroll. Today, all the scrolls are published.
Now, one of the things you also mentioned was the question of textual variants within Tanakh. There are a lot of people today who are observant, and yet when they enter into the area of Bible scholarship on the university level, seem to compartmentalize their lives, where they have difficulty because Torah Sinai gets a little complicated when you start talking about textual variants. You are both a great professor and also yeshivish. How do you do that? How does that work for you?
I think that the problems that people get into is because they start with a kind of an overdone false model of the reality. And then when they see that that isn't really the reality, they now have a problem in understanding it. I think if you start with a more practical reality, I would just refer people to reading more widely on the topic in the traditional sources. And for example, anybody who would study some of the material in the Masoretic tradition, which people don't study anymore, right? But if you would study these types of things like the Minchat Shai, which was written, shortly, actually the Renaissance period, by Yedidia Nordsi, Shlomo Yedidia Nordsi. If you read this work, you will see the tremendous amount of difference in manuscript readings and variations that existed until the printing of the so-called Second Rabbinic Bible, which is the basis for all the later Tanachim, until they started to use the Leningrad and Aleppo codices. But the point I'm making is that you realize that the variations were there, and you see in the Gemara itself. So I think what the crisis that people often have starts from some kind of an overdone, oversimplistic assumption or set of assumptions about what it means for a text passed down from antiquity to be accurate and consistent. And then you get shocked when you find out, well, it's not exactly that way. It's a little bit more complicated. So I would say that it never really bothered me, this question. And once you realize, I can quote a colleague who retired from Notre Dame, Eugene Ulrich, a non-Jewish colleague. He sort of had a way of putting it. He said, the good news is that their Bible is our Bible. The bad news is that there are some little variations. And these variations don't change the message of the Bible. And what's perhaps more important is that we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls that there also were text types that are a little bit different. And this is a more complicated issue from a religious point of view. I don't know if that's where the problem lies, because they're clearly based on a text that looks like what we call the Proto-Masoretic text. But nonetheless, they exist. So this is the case, for example, in the Greek Bible, the Septuagint. Almost all the variations can be explained as either interpretations, mistakes, or small variants. But the text that it's based on is similar to the one that we use for everything except a few small exceptions like Yirmiyahu, because there was a shorter version of Yirmiyahu that they were using. And when we go, for example, to the Samaritan Bible, which is another, we have in Qumran what we call Proto-Samaritan, which is like the Torah of the Samaritans, but it doesn't mention Mount Gerizim and its temple. And then when you look at this, it's clear that it's created by harmonizing texts within the regular Torah. So in other words, to simplify the two things that I just said, these other texts are ultimately based on a text very much like the one that is the normal one of today. And so even though these text types do exist, they're secondary. So this takes away much of the challenge of this from a religious point of view. But on the other hand, anybody who studies the Gemara will understand immediately. We have in the Gemara a few times the halachot that are based on different text than the one we have. I mean, the famous one of funds that, the whole debate about Totafot and how many plurals there are and how many singulars there are with a vav and without a vav. Sukkot with a vav, without a vav. Tosafot talks about this, and it becomes very clear from study of Tanakh. You have things Tikkunei Sofrim, E20, all these different changes that are acknowledged in the text. So it just really depends on, to some extent.
Because it's interesting, when I was studying in college, Iturei Sofrim and Tikkunei Sofrim, we were told there were some changes, there were some modifications.
Right.
Everything has been documented. And nowadays, when you listen to some sources, they deny that there could have ever been a change or a Kriya Tiv could have.
Yeah, but it's in the Gemara. What are you going to explain the Gemara? I don't know how they explain it when it says the Gemara. I mean, it's a funny kind of thing. What happens is you set up a false. Look, let me tell you a story. A man came to see me. He became observant because he was told that there is absolute, all Torahs are the same. This proves that Torah was given by God. All Torahs were the same. So he found out that there's a difference with the word Petzuat Hakah, and some spell it with an aleph and some spell it with a hey. Now, he started to stop being observant. So he had children in yeshiva, and one of them had used my book at University of Pennsylvania. He told me you should go see me. So he came to see me. I asked him, I said, let me ask you a question. Do you think it's a good idea to believe that since God created the universe, we should stay one day away from doing work to symbolize that he's the creator? And he's looking at me like I'm crazy. I said, look, you have to understand something. The reason why people observe traditional Judaism is because they believe it's right, not because there are X number of words in the Torah, Y number of words, this word spelled in the aleph, right? We think these are right ideas. So, and that's why we believe in them. So he realized that his whole sense of how to decide to be an observant Jew was silly. And he actually went back and rebuilt his whole personal attitude, which is fine. But can you imagine a guy thought that since everything is the same, but they're not the same, as we know. And certainly anybody who would look at Ashkenazic manuscripts in the Middle Ages, where you have all kinds of spelling differences, would determine immediately that this was a crazy way to understand Torah, right? So we have to be careful. It's the same thing as the problem, obviously, with the Torah codes, that we know certainly from the Gemara that the vavs and yuds, the vowels, the numbers of letters weren't standardized. So, what can you learn from that? I don't know.
Well, the Torah codes will be a different conversation for a different time. But I do believe that anyone who bases their belief on Torah codes can also then start finding other codes that do other things. And
correct. I mean,
not the source. We're almost out of time. Just one last question. How many, would you guess, how many colleagues do you have who are, as you are, a Talmud Chacham, and behind you, there's a full set of the Masifta Shas. How many are living in both worlds simultaneously?
I don't want to make up numbers, but you have to remember one thing. It depends how you're going to look at the field. I can tell you that I just came back from the Association for Jewish Studies, which is an organization of 1,400 scholars in mostly North America who work on Judaic studies in various fields and universities. I can tell you there are a substantial number of Orthodox Jews there. I haven't tested them out on their knowledge of Shas, let alone, asking them questions about Yoredea or something like this, right? But there are quite a number of observant Jews involved in Jewish studies. And I think that, that's a wonderful thing. And there are quite a number of scholars who know quite a lot of this stuff. And once in a while you find that somebody doesn't get it right. But I think it's a larger number than most people realize. Let me put it to you that way. There are a larger number than most people.
And in terms of the Department of Judaic Studies at NYU, is that a growing department?
Well, we are a growing department for a funny reason, because we just had four retirees and one person leave because she got married to someone who was working someplace else, and she was able to get a closer position. So we're growing because now we shrank and we're replacing people. But the field is growing. I don't think we're going to grow much bigger, but we have 15 positions. And if you really think it through and you look at the amount of students and the amount of enrollment, it's a pretty big, we're probably one of the largest outside of Israel. And I don't think we have too much to grow. The more important question is that we continue to train excellent grad students go out and take positions as scholars of Judaic studies in fields ranging from Bible up to the modern period, which we do. And the other important question, whether the faculty continues to produce excellent research, and that's going on. So from that point of view, we're growing. I think once we refill our numbers, I don't think that we're going to be growing much bigger, but I don't think there's really much of a need to, given the size of the department and the way it covers virtually all the areas of Judaic studies, which was the goal when we set it up.
Well, as the last student of record of what used to be called the Department of Hebrew Culture and Education, and as a graduate from the Department of Judaic Studies at NYU, Professor, I thank you so very much for your time, your scholarship, and your friendship. And I look forward to the next time you'll visit us in Chicago, and I'll be able to learn from you face to face, not via the video.
Okay, thank you very much.
Have a wonderful Hanukkah.
You should all have a wonderful Hanukkah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.